Hello everyone, Sam here, and today we're going to talk about King Solomon's Mines. We are reading this for Haggard January, which is a reading event many booktubers are doing to discuss the works of H. Rider Haggard. King Solomon's Mines is obviously his most popular work, so this is probably going to be a common one done by other booktubers. But as I hadn't really read H. Rider Haggard before, I figured I might as well file in with everybody and read this, especially since this was a very early story in Haggard's career, and it's the one that he is most famous for even today. So, we are going to be reading it. I read it from my Kindle, but it is available online at many resources. I think it's on Gutenberg. If it is, I'll leave a link in the description. But there's other sources too, I know for a fact, because this is a story that's in the public domain, so it's very easy to find. I just happen to have a Kindle edition that I bought, I think, a year and a half ago, and I'm very satisfied with it because it actually includes all the original illustrations. So this was a good reading experience on this Kindle. But to talk about the actual story, King Solomon's Mines was published in 1885, and it was, of course, written by H. Rider Haggard. And the story follows the great white hunter Allan Quatermain, who is a very well-known and experienced hunter within southern Africa, specifically within the Natal colony of Africa, which is controlled by the British at the time. And one day he is on a boat going down the African coast, and he's approached by an English aristocrat named Sir Henry Curtis, and Curtis's friend, a retired British Navy captain called Captain Good. And the two of them hire Quatermain to help them find Sir Henry's brother, who disappeared several months ago searching for a thing called King Solomon's Mines in an uncharted region of southern Africa. King Solomon is, of course, the famous king from the Bible who was well known for his wisdom. So they offer this job to Quatermain, and Quatermain isn't initially interested, but he learns that there's a possibility that Sir Henry's brother did find those mines, which supposedly had lots of diamonds. And Quatermain is not necessarily poor, but he's obviously not a rolling in dough. And he has a son named Harry he wants to support in England. So Quatermain accepts the job. And so the three of them, along with some servants, set off on the expedition to find King Solomon's Mines. And they have to go through harsh deserts, freezing mountains, and fight wild animals to hopefully find Sir Henry's brother, and possibly even the riches of the diamonds. But like all adventures, there becomes a complication, because it turns out that the land they were looking for is not entirely uninhabited, and it is still filled with a long-lost race of people, and this land is called Kukana land. And as you would expect, some complications arise when they have to navigate this lost civilization that they didn't think still existed. So that's the general plot. I don't want to give away much more, but that's the essential plot of King Solomon's Mines. So, a few interesting tidbits before I actually review the story. This was a story that H. Rider Haggard supposedly wrote on a bet. That's a thing that's commonly circulated around. They supposedly wrote this story on a bet. And also, supposedly, he wrote it in 6 weeks. Haggard liked to claim he wrote the story in 6 weeks. But some evidence I've found implies that it was probably closer to 3 months than 6 weeks. This is kind of up for debate, and this is based on Haggard's logs, because he kept logs of his work when he was writing. And several people say it was probably closer to 3 months. My suspicion is that he might have indeed written the story in 6 weeks, but my guess is that he might not have been done, because there's a big difference between writing a first draft of a story and being done with the story. So it could have been he wrote the first draft in 6 weeks, and those remaining other 6 weeks might have been polishing it. Like I said, it's kind of up for debate, but it's a fun story to talk about. If you saw my Haggard January video, you'll know that H. Rider Haggard had actually a lot of experience with South Africa, because he actually lived in the colony of Natal for several years as a young man. So when he was writing King Solomon's Mines, he was very much not writing, like, he didn't read about South Africa in the local books and like daydream about the land from a cozy bungalow in like Devonshire. He was there in South Africa, so he knew a lot about the people and the climate. So he was very much writing what he knew, which is a common suggestion for authors, to write what you know. And Haggard evidently did know. And as I mentioned earlier, this was Haggard's first major success as an author. He'd released 3 or 4 books. He'd released about 3 or 4 books before he did King Solomon's Mines, but they were not really successes. I think one story he wrote, he got like £50 for, which wasn't bad money in the day, but it was kind of, it was a mild success in that he got paid, but nobody really talked about it. So, and the stories he wrote were initially like non-fiction stories about South Africa, or like these Victorian dramas that were very in vogue at the time, but they didn't take off. King Solomon's Mines did, and it was by Haggard fully embracing this like romantic adventure mindset and fully leaning into sort of this fantastical side. And in a lot of ways, by rejecting the typical focuses of the day, or the I guess you could say the trends in literature at the time, he managed to create his own trend, which was the Lost World story. King Solomon's Mines was in many senses the first true Lost World story. It wasn't necessarily the first. I should correct, because you had stories like Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, and there were plenty of other stories about lost civilizations before this. But King Solomon's Mines was probably the one that you can say popularized the idea of the lost world, where the storyline is always a lost civilization is found by modern day adventurers. And this is a concept that many writers have used before. And King Solomon's Mines was, if not the first one to do it was definitely the one to popularize the idea of the lost world. So this is a very important story within that subgenre of fantasy and science fiction. And even if you haven't read King Solomon's Mines, you know about King Solomon's Mines because it has been adapted numerous times in multiple media. There have been movies, there have been comics, there's been TV. I don't know if it was shows, but there were TV specials, radio, and probably other media I don't even know about because this is just such a hugely popular and influential story that you just can't escape its influence. So this is very important in not just the annals of science fiction and fantasy literature, but literature in general. So this is very exciting to read. So I'm going to approach this like a book review and talk about what I liked and what I didn't like. And fortunately for me, there was a lot to like about this story. It had a lot of things I really enjoyed. The most obvious thing is that it has a very strong setup with this search for Sir Henry's missing brother. It's a very simple goal that they're trying to achieve, but it's straightforward and you understand why the characters are going out on this journey. And I actually like that the discovery of Kukana land is not really that far out of left field. Like, we know that many people have searched for King Solomon's Mines, and logic dictates that, well, there must have been some kind of civilization around it because you'd have to have some kind of civilization for the miners. And because of this search for the brother, we end up in Kukana land. And the fact that there are people still there is a surprise, but it's not horribly out of left field. We've already been kind of built up to realize, well, something is going on with this civilization. There's probably a chance somebody is still there. So I really like that thing of where we start with one goal and then we kind of work to another because of the circumstances of the story. I also really like that Alan Quatermain is an aged protagonist. He's 55 in this story, though supposedly Haggard kind of keeps switching his age around. He would do earlier stories where Quatermain's age doesn't quite match up with this story. But for this story, he's 55, which is fairly aged. He's not an elderly man, but he is well into middle age, and it is kind of unique to have that kind of person as the main character in an adventure story instead of a younger, strapping man who, to be fair, Sir Henry is younger, and so is Captain Good, but Quatermain is the main character and who we witness the story through. And I think it really works because it kind of forces Quatermain into the position of, he can't really fight his way out of situations. He's a good hunter. He speaks a lot of the African languages. But if it comes down to one-on-one fighting, he's probably not going to come out against a younger opponent. So it gives the story a sort of good bit of tension because we kind of have to figure out, well, how is he going to get out of this situation when he's not necessarily the strongest guy. So that's a very good element of the story. I also really like the action scenes in this story. I was kind of worried going into this because this is a story from the pre-pulp era. This is, like I said, 1885. So I was kind of worried going in that it was going to be very dry action scenes. one person slapped the other and it's just said very blandly, or it's overwritten and, every single detail is written down. A lot of Victorian literature kind of had that tendency of describing every single tiny detail of a scene to where it wasn't really necessary, and it kind of ruined the flow of the action. That is not the case here of King Solomon's Mines. It is suitably descriptive, but it doesn't become overburdened. It doesn't get too wordy. And there's actually a lot of good action scenes here. The ones that really stood out for me was there's a point early on where they go on an elephant hunt, and it starts to go wrong because one of the folks shooting does not kill one of the elephants on the first shot. And if you know anything about a wounded elephant, you'll know that's not a good creature to be near when they're in that predicament. And there's also a huge battle scene about 3/4 of the way through the story between two armies that deals a lot with like military positioning and fighting, and it's surprisingly well handled. You're not confused about what's going on. The action is very good. Also, towards the end of that battle, Sir Henry gets into this one-on-one fight with an evil king when they're both adorned in like ancient armor. And reading that scene, I could 100% see how Robert E. Howard was influenced by this story, and H. Rider Haggard in general, because that scene is straight out of a Conan story. Like, you could totally see Conan fighting someone in that style. It would not surprise me if Conan, at least in part, came from that one scene of Sir Henry fighting the evil king. So that was really fun to see. Another thing I really enjoyed was that every detail that is set up in the first couple of chapters from before they go on their expedition, every single detail has a payoff later in the story, sometimes even up to the last chapter. Every single detail that is set up there has a payoff at some point in the story. Because, for instance, Alan Quatermain knows this 16th century mapmaker who was Portuguese and actually found Kucana land in the 16th century. He knows that he died searching for it, and, Alan Quatermain has the map, but you kind of think, oh, okay, that map maker, he's just there to explain how Quatermain got the map, and, he's not going to factor into the story. But later on during their journey, they actually find the map maker's body in a frozen cave, and it's preserved his body. So that was kind of surprising. You think, oh, well, that map maker, he's just part of the backstory. He's so ancient, he's not even going to factor in. But he does factor in, besides the map. They find his body. So there's a lot of really neat payoffs from that, from those opening chapters. So that was very satisfying and effective. I also really like how all the characters have these really strong motivations to go on the journey. Quatermain, he wants to provide for his son Harry, who is a doctor, and he gets Sir Henry to promise that, well, if anything happens to us, money is going to go to my son Harry so he can become educated and become a doctor. So he's kind of doing this thing that he expects is suicidal. He knows that the area they're going to has a very slim chance of them getting out alive. So, but he's doing it because he really wants to help his son. And then you have Sir Henry, who is trying to make up a mistake he made because he got into a bitter feud with his brother, and his brother stormed off to go find King Solomon's Mines. So Sir Henry is kind of doing this expedition to make up for what he did to his brother. So that's a very good motivation. And, you know, Captain Good is there mostly because he's friends with Sir Henry, but also because he's just looking for a good adventure. One of the small plot lines is that he was kind of kicked out of the British Navy, not dishonorably. He was just, you know, discharged because they thought his best years were beyond him. So he's kind of just, he wants to prove that he still has that adventurous spirit. And that's kind of an interesting motivation. And also, there's one other character who has a interesting background, and that's Umbapa. And Umbapa is a Zulu servant who joins with them because he says he's familiar with the land that they're going through, and also because he's sort of searching for something. But he doesn't really say what, and he's very mysterious and doesn't really say a whole lot about what he's doing. But when you learn his reason, you discover, oh yeah, he had a very good reason to look for Kukana land. So that's a lot of fun. And speaking of Kukana land, I really like how Kukana land, even though it's rediscovered by Quatermain in this party, it's not fully explained. Like, there's some elements about it that are not really elaborated upon. Like, there are these huge idols carved from a mountain, and they're sort of explained what these gods are, but they're not really elaborated upon because they're meant to be idols of the civilization that used to be there and was not originally Zulu. That's one of the key things. They were not Zulus, whoever these ancient beings were. But we're not really... There's hints about who they could be, but we're not really told what was up with them. And there's also this really great scene where they find the burial ground of the dead royals of the Kukana land royal family. And it's this really creepy scene of a mummification process where all of these royals have been sat under dripping water, and because it's in a mountain, the water drips down full of sediment, and over the centuries the sediment builds up around their body, and they all look like these cloaked figures sitting at a table. It actually reminded me of a figure in Luray Caverns. For those of you who don't know, in Luray, North Carolina, there's these famous caverns that have a whole lot of unique formations due to the water and erosion. And one of the figures in the Luray Caverns is a figure they call Pluto's ghost, because Pluto was the god of the underworld in Roman mythology, and it looks like this hooded figure that's just sort of staring out at anyone who passes by. And it's a very striking figure. If you look at the thumbnail to this video, it's the one that's on the right side of the thumbnail. That's the actual Pluto's ghost. And there's very similar figures in King Solomon's Mines. So seeing that pop up with something that I've seen before, it was like really surprising and interesting. So what else did I like? Oh yeah, this thing I really enjoyed. I like how ambiguous the story is about whether there is magic or not. Because you would think that since this is a Lost World story, there would be lots of like magical or fantastical elements. Because that's what a lot of later authors do, like Edgar Rice Burroughs or Robert E. Howard. They added a lot of magical elements to their Lost Worlds. But that's really not the case here. There's really no explicit use of magic. Alan Quatermain and his gang often fake having magic because they at one point need to pretend that they're sorcerers in order to not be destroyed. But we and there are witches in this story, but we're never shown anybody doing explicit magic. In fact, they actually kind of bring up at one point there's this ancient witch named Gugul, and Gugul is said to be, she's immortal because she served many kings of the past. Even the older members of the Kukana land inhabitants remember seeing her. But it's also posited that, well, maybe she's not immortal. Maybe Gugul is like more of a title passed down from mother to daughter, and that all the Guguls of the past have just been descendants of each other, and whenever one dies, the other takes their place and knows all her secrets, and that's how they keep the facade up. But maybe there's magic, maybe there's not, and I actually really like that because it keeps the reader on edge. We're not really sure, well, is there something more mystical going on, or is it more, benign and can be realistically explained? This is interesting because a lot of later Haggard stories explicitly featured magic. The story he did right after this, She, has a lot of magical elements to it. And there are later Alan Quatermain stories that have explicit magic in it too. So the fact that there is none here is really interesting, or at least nothing overtly magical. That's kind of interesting, and I actually like how that's done here. And indeed, I think the biggest thing that helps the story is the fact that it is a very simple story. It's just a straightforward adventure of a party heading into an uncharted land, discovering a lost people, and the things that happen when you discover said people. So it very much avoids the common problems of an overcomplicated plot. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It's only about 20 chapters, so it does not overstay its welcome or, feel like it's dragging. But it also is not so fast that you can't, build up any sort of emotion towards the characters. It's kind of right at the perfect length. And there's an old phraseology. I've heard it used in wrestling, but I know it's been used other places too. It's called KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. And Haggard very much keeps it simple here. And I think the story really benefits from the fact that it is so straightforward. We don't get bogged down in too many subplots or too many melodramas. It's just the adventure told straightforward, and I think that's what makes the story really work. Just a second. So that's a lot of praise I've heaped on the story, and it is a very good story. But are there any criticisms I have of it? In all honesty, not many, because this is a very good story, and I only really have three. The camera doesn't. You're a little too close to the camera. You can't get your fingers in right. There's only really three major criticisms I have of the story. The first is that the story is told in a letter that Alan Quatermain sends to his son Harry. And because it's in a letter and it's after the adventure, we know that Alan Quatermain survives. And because of that, we don't have much tension about whether he's going to make it out all right or not. Because, well, obviously he's writing the letter, so how would he... he obviously has to have some ability if he pulled that off. I guess it doesn't fully ruin the story because we do have other characters like Umbapqua, Sir Henry, Captain Good, who we aren't sure if they come out all right at the end. So it doesn't fully ruin it, but it does kind of make it like, well, we know Quartermain's going to pull out of this, so it's not as tense as it maybe could have been if the story had just been told in a straightforward present tense, or just told without the letter element. The second criticism I would have is that the setup for the story, there's one element of it that is a bit contrived, because it makes sense that Sir Henry knows about his brother's goings-on, because he probably had information, he heard from people what he was going to do. But by some interesting coincidence, Alan Quartermain happens to have the map to Kukuanaland, because like 5 years earlier he happened to run into a Portuguese trader who was looking for Kukuanaland, and the trader was the descendant of that 16th century mapmaker, and Quartermain just so happened to befriend him, and just so happened to find him dying in the desert that you have to cross to get to Kukuanaland, and just so happens to have the map because of that coincidental meeting. So that element is a little contrived, and the fact that he had it for 5 years and just didn't really do anything with it. It was kind of like, yeah, that's a bit of an odd element, and I get why it's there. Haggard doesn't want to spend too long figuring out, well, how do they get the map to figure out, oh, well, Quartermain just happened to have it all these years. I get why it's there, but it is a bit contrived from a writing standpoint. He maybe could have found a slightly more believable way to get that map into their hands. The third major criticism I have is that Quartermain himself feels a little inconsistent, because at times he's trying to portray himself as like an everyman. He's like, oh, he's the average Joe on the expedition. Sir Henry's the aristocrat, Captain Good is the veteran, and Quartermain is just the every guy. He's meant to be the audience surrogate. And even at one point Quartermain says, "Oh, I'm a bit of a coward. I don't do much. I'm just the average man." But the problem is that I'm not sure I buy that a great white hunter who has hunted elephants for like several decades in the story. He's been a well-established hunter for decades at this point, who has gone on many adventures, because even in this story, even in the first Quartermain story, he does offhandedly mention, oh yeah, I've been through a number of situations. I just don't buy him as an everyman. Like, this is a guy who would have some sort of gumption and drive, because hunting elephants is not an easy job, and it is not a job that I could see a coward having, like he insists he is. And even in the story itself, I don't really buy him as a coward, because he does a lot of brave things. So, again, you could make the argument that this is him sort of downplaying his heroic nature to his son Harry, because it is written in a letter, and maybe he doesn't want to exaggerate his personality. But it does kind of feel a little weird that Haggard's trying to frame him as the everyman, when just by the nature of his profession and his livelihood, I just don't buy that just an average guy would do that. This would be a man with a little elevated of a personality in order to do all that. And apparently Haggard agreed, because Haggard, from what I've read from others, is that Haggard kind of changed Quartermain's characterization in the later years, when he was writing him in like the 1910s and 1920s. Quatermain became a little more of a action hero. He wasn't this like reserved guy who barely understood women like he is in this story. He became much more of a ladies' man in later stories, all of which were pretty much prequels. I think there's only one or two other stories that occur after King Solomon's Mines, canonically, for Quatermain. So Haggard obviously kind of saw, well, this characterization doesn't seem to fully jive with what this kind of guy would be like. So, yeah, there's some elements of Quatermain's characterization here that do feel a little off. I'd really be curious to read the later stories Haggard wrote to see how he portrayed Quatermain in those. But that is all the criticisms I really have of the story. As such, I am now going to give my ranking of the story. My rankings will always go from a 5-star rating, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. This might sound cliche, but I have to go 5 out of 5 for this story. It is a very good adventure story. I really enjoyed it. And I can definitely see why it was so influential for later writers, because it just has the perfect format for an adventure story. Just that perfect setup, expedition, discovery, what happens after you make the discovery, and then the either escape or return. Like, just the format of the whole story goes perfectly from point A to point B. So I fully understand why all these writers took inspiration from it, because it's just so well put together. And I would say definitely check it out if you haven't read it, because if you are really into Lost World stories, this is a must. And even if you just want like a really good adventure tale, this is a fantastic story for an adventure. And like I said, it's surprisingly not as weighted as a lot of Victorian fiction used to be. A lot of Victorian fiction was kind of wordy, and it took a long time to get to the point. Haggard does not have that problem. He very much has very punchy language and very good grasp of action. And I can also see why so many pulp authors took inspiration from, because this is more or less a pulp story, even though it was written a decade before pulp magazines even existed. So that's very impressive, and I think anybody who's into the Lost World stories, adventure stories, or even just looking for a good book, I think you'll really enjoy this. So definitely check this out. I'm going to actually I like this so much, I'm going to get a physical copy of it, a good one that I can find, preferably one with the illustrations, because the illustrations are really good. I don't somebody will know who the artist is, but the art here is just splendiferous. So get this story, get it physically, because physical media is king. I know I'm saying that with a Kindle in my hand, but sometimes you get a Kindle out of necessity. If you can, get it in physical, because physical is king. So with that ranking, I always like to talk about whether a story has inspired me in my own writing, because I am a professional writer and like writing myself, and I really like talking about my inspirations. So was I inspired by King Solomon's Mines for my own story writing? Yes, is the blunt answer. I really want to write a Lost World story now. And the lesson I've really learned here is that Haggard was writing what he knew, what he'd experienced in South Africa. So I kind of realize if I have to do a Lost World story and make it believable, I kind of have to focus on an area I am really familiar with and can sort of explain how a lost world exists in this land. So if I write a Lost World story, I am probably going to set it in my native land of Florida, because Florida actually has a lot of opportunities for Lost World stories, particularly during the colonial age of Spain. The Spanish were the first major colonial explorers of Florida, so there's kind of an angle there if you wanted to do a Lost World story. But yeah, so this is a really great story. I had a lot of fun with this. I had more fun than I was expecting. So if this was Haggard at his earliest, I'm kind of curious to see what Haggard was in his later days, because I've also heard some people say that while King Solomon's Mines is his most famous story, some of his later ones were a little more stronger written, which I think is a great sign, because this was pretty strongly written. So I'll definitely be checking out more H. Rider Haggard stuff in the near future. And I'm also going to talk about a few other H. Rider Haggard stories, at least one more for H. Rider Haggard January. And then I'm going to talk about a nonfiction academic study of H. Rider Haggard, titled Rider Haggard by, I believe it's Norman Etherington. And I'm also going to talk about a story inspired by H. Rider Haggard. So you should see those reviews up within the next week, and that'll be a real fun time. I'm having a good Haggard January so far, so hopefully those stories live up to that as well. So get King Solomon's Mines if you haven't already. It's a fantastic story, and I almost guarantee you're going to enjoy it. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a fun time reading this.